This is lecture 7A. We're going to talk about classical Indian societies. So Indian society from about 500 BCE to about 500 CE. First, I just want to talk about a couple of empires. The Indian subcontinent saw a couple of empires that emerged in the classical era, and they're very much along the lines of the Persian Empire that we've already seen, or along the lines of the Han Dynasty that we saw in China. And so they developed a much more complicated government with much bigger bureaucracies, organized tax code. They built bigger cities. They controlled a much larger territory. They had to work on communication and transportation. So all of the things that we see with these classical societies, these larger and more complicated societies emerging, we also see on the Indian subcontinent in Indian civilization. So the first empire I want to talk about is the Mauryan Empire. And the Mauryan Empire really emerged in India, in northern India, largely because of the vacuum created when Alexander the Great pulled back and died very abruptly. Now you remember that in the 320s, the 330s, and then into the late 320s BCE, Alexander the Great went on this great tear across. He knocked off the Persian Empire, and then he invaded India, and he actually conquered a significant chunk of northern India before he pulled back. His soldiers actually threatened to revolt, because they felt like they were going too far from Greece and they were just never going to stop. So he had to pull back. And what happened then is he sort of created a power vacuum in northern India, because he had come in and knocked off existing kingdoms and conquered a bunch of territory, and then he pulls out all of a sudden. And so in the space that's left there, you see the Mauryan Empire sort of emerge rather abruptly. In 324 BCE, an adventurer named Gupta Maurya takes over one of the kingdoms in northern India, the Magadha kingdom. And from that power base of the Magadha kingdom, he then begins to attack all of his neighbors, and he conquers them fairly quickly because Alexander the Great had left left no powerful kingdoms in his wake. And so Chandragupta Maurya conquers a fairly large territory, and then his son and grandson expand that territory considerably. In particular, his grandson, Ashoka, is really one of the most powerful of the Indian emperors of this time period. Ashoka really conquers the northern two-thirds of India, and he begins to push farther and farther south, and he builds this enormous empire. The Mauryan Empire is really powerful. But Chandragupta Maurya is actually kind of interesting because, I mean, he first of all, he did a lot of things that we've already seen with the other emperors. He built enormous cities. Pataliputra, which the name is in the notes, was a fantastic city with big, monumental architecture and nicely laid out streets and things like that, and palaces. He codified the tax code. He improved. He had big public works projects on roads and things like that. So he did a whole bunch of the things that we think of as the standard sort of empire building things that these classical empires did. But Ashoka had one really interesting thing about him, and that was that he converts to Buddhism. And I'll talk about Buddhism later in this lecture. But one of the key ideas of Buddhism is that you're not really striving to change the world. You're accepting the world as it is. And this leads to a sort of a passivity. And in particular, Ashoka really became sort of disgusted with conquest. He began to realize that, one of the key ideas of Buddhism is that everything is connected, everything is part of a single whole. And so he really saw conquest as a horrific thing that's hurting, the unified whole of the universe, not just the people he's conquering. And Ashoka really then sort of becomes a pacifist in a way. And when he dies, his children are raised as Buddhists, and it really becomes very hard for them to exert good control over this empire, given that they have embraced this sort of pacifist form of Buddhism. And so after Ashoka's death in particular, his children really don't do a good job of holding the empire together, and it lasts for another 150 years, because of the power and the stability of both the bureaucracy that I'm talking about, and the fact that most of society was Hindu, and I'll talk about that later. But by the 180s, 185 at the latest BCE, the Mauryan Empire had just sort of fallen apart. And what happens then is it breaks up into these smaller kingdoms that had been there before. The Mauryan Empire had conquered to unify the empire. It just sort of breaks up into these small kingdoms again. And then you see a period of 300-400 years where the continent is broken up into these smaller kingdoms and they're fighting each other and there's no unified empire. But then, about in the 300s CE, you see another empire emerge, and this is called the Gupta Empire. And it's almost a carbon copy of the Mauryan Empire, because basically you have an adventurer named Chandragupta, not to be confused with Chandragupta Maurya. This guy's name is Chandragupta, and in the 320s, he conquers the Magadha. He stages a coup and takes over the Magadha kingdom, which is the same kingdom that Chandragupta Maurya started with, and then he conquers northern India. Right, so he builds the Gupta Empire, and the Gupta Empire wouldn't last all that long. It would actually begin to fall apart by the early 500s, and by the 550s it ceased to exist. But for 200 years, the Gupta Empire is this major empire in the northern two-thirds of India. So the Mauryan Empire and the Gupta Empire provided a lot of stability over a long period of time in India, but actually India had some other sources of stability that beyond the governments, and that came from the religions. So I want to talk about three religions in Indian society for the rest of this portion of the lecture. First, I want to talk about Jainism, and then I want to talk about Buddhism, and then in the last portion of the lecture, I'll talk about Hinduism. So let me talk about Jainism first. Jainism is credited with being founded by a man named Vardhamana Mahavira, who lived from 540 to 486 BCE. And I want you to notice again that this is, his dates are similar to the dates we'll see Hinduism and Buddhism later, but we also see Judaism, and it's not too far off from the time period that Confucianism was being founded, and it's not too far off from Zoroastrianism becoming the major religion in Persia at that time period. So Vardhamana Mahavira began, his religion is emerging out of this old Vedic religion, which I'd talked about before. The Vedic religion, of course, was developed in India. It was certainly around by 800 BCE, and it was mostly focused on priests, the Brahmin caste, doing rituals and sacrifices and things like that to please the gods. And so it was mostly focused on ritual and the priests. But as I mentioned, this book, the Upanishads, which was written over several hundred years before, somewhere around between 800 and 400 BCE. The Upanishads began to refocus this religion on personal conduct and personal morality, and they began to develop this idea of wisdom. And in particular, I mentioned in previous lectures that they developed this idea that each human soul is reborn over and over and over again. And this cycle of life, death, and rebirth is called samsara. And samsara kind of sucks. I mean, it's you are basically being reborn to suffer through another life. And so the goal of the religions we're going to talk about here is always to escape from samsara and to free your soul from having to be reborn in human suffering over and over again. Well, Vardhamana Mahavira argued that the way to do this was to basically, you want to escape from your body. So the way to do this is to train your soul to sort of reject the needs of the body. And so Mahavira embraced the ideas of asceticism. And the gist of his story is that he spent decades learning how to be an ascetic, to meditate and to deny his body clothing, luxury, most food, etc. And eventually Mahavira was credited with simply meditating until he died. He managed to reject all food and water and everything and then escape from his body. And the idea behind Jainism is that, there's actually a huge sort of intellectual apparatus behind it. They think that there's multi-million year cycles of existence, and that each cycle is, there are different cycles that are thousands of years long, and that each cycle has a prophet who comes and sort of explains enlightenment to people. And so Vardhamana Mahavira is actually seen as the 24th of these prophets, and it's a million in this million-year cycle of history. But essentially, he is taken then as the model for how Jains is what they're called, people who follow this religion, are supposed to act, and that's basically that he elaborates the idea that every time you eat or drink or do anything with your body, really, you're causing, you're killing something else, right? Every time you eat, you're killing whatever plant or animal you ate, and every time you you go for a walk, you're going to step on things and kill things, and even breathing, you might breathe in a bug and kill it, and each of those things is basically a karmic burden on you. And I mentioned a little bit about this in a previous lecture, but the idea is that in your life, you do all these things, good or bad, and the good things that you do reduce your karmic burden, you have less karma, and the bad things you do increase your karmic burden. And the idea is that when you die, you're reborn in the cycle of life, death, and rebirth according to how much karma you have. So you might come back as something lower if you have a huge karmic burden. If you've done a lot of evil things in your life, you're going to come back maybe as a lower class individual, or maybe even as a bug or something like that. And if you do only good things, you'll increase. Well, Vardhamana Mahavira argued that basically the only way to escape your karmic burden is to stop eating, stop drinking, renounce all physical pleasures, and so reduce your karmic burden to the point where you can escape, right? And so this asceticism is the path to avoiding dying with a karmic burden. Jainism requires then severe asceticism. You basically have to reject all physical things in the world because those increase your karmic burden. You have to you basically eat only as you eat as little as you can possibly make yourself eat, and the ultimate goal is ultimately to die without a karmic burden. But this makes it a very hard religion for a lot of people to practice, right? And Jainism would never become a major, religion, but it would never attract a whole lot of followers because it's so hard to practice this religion. But there are still Jains today. There are still people who practice Jainism today. But it's not a religion that's easy to become a mass movement that will transform society, right? It became a popular religion. It attracted enough people to continually find new converts and to become a religion, but it never transformed Indian society. But one of the interesting things about this, I'm going to talk in the discussion today about how religions can stabilize or destabilize a society. And Jainism is actually a pretty destabilizing religion, and for a couple of reasons. One is it's rejecting all sort of economic activity, which means that, society, the economy would grind to a halt if everybody truly practiced Jainism. But second, it rejects sex also, so there would be no more children or anything like that. The human race would stop. But also, it sees everybody as ultimately equal. Every soul is totally equal at bottom. And so it doesn't recognize the Indian caste system or class system or anything like that. And so I'll talk more in the discussion, but it's a potentially destabilizing religion. So that's the first of the religions. I'm going to turn in the next part of this lecture to Buddhism, which is the second of the religions I want to talk about. And then in the third part of the lecture, we'll focus on Hinduism.